Mr. Vice President, in the President's call to reopen schools, is there a situation in some states that the health situation doesn't allow for this, where you would be supportive of some states continuing distance learning? And we now see the President threatening to cut off funding for schools. Is that a serious threat, and what would that look like?
Well, the principle behind our approach to this coronavirus pandemic has been to provide federal support as states manage their own response. And what I can tell you is in the weekly reports that we provide governors, we're down to the county level in terms of where the new cases are, where the positivity lies. And I think we would account for the fact that while we hope every school in America is able to open this fall, there may be some states and local communities that given cases or positivity in that community may adjust to either a certain set of days or certain limitations. And we'll be very respectful of that. What the President's made clear, though, is that we think it's absolutely imperative that every state and territory in this country make steps and take steps, rather, to get kids back in the classroom to the fullest extent possible. We really believe that every state has the ability to do that, but for those individual communities that may be seeing outbreaks, we'll work with them, give them the guidance and the support to be able to implement the policies that they deem are most appropriate. Our mission here is to safely reopen our schools, and as you've heard from all of these members of our task force, it's not just about kids learning and not falling behind academically. It's about all the vital services that children receive at our schools. It's about working families. It's about opening up America again. And so we'll continue to drive on that. On your second point, I would tell you that at this point, I think 90% of education funding comes from the states, roughly 10%, depending on states' budgets, come from the federal government. And as we work with Congress on the next round of state support, we're going to be looking for ways to give states a strong incentive and an encouragement to get kids back to school. Please, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. The President tweeted this morning that he disagrees with the CDC's very tough and expensive guidelines for reopening schools. Do you also disagree with those guidelines? And are you concerned that you may be putting the health of students and teachers at risk by trying to meet the President's demand to reopen?
Well, the President and I spoke about that this morning, and I think what you will see in the coming days, what you heard from Dr. Redfield yesterday at the summit and again today, is very consistent with the President's objective and the concerns that he's raised. We don't want the guidance from CDC to be a reason why schools don't open. We want to partner with states, with local education officials, with governors, with local health officials to find a way to meet their needs to open up. And I think the President's statement this morning was simply reflective of that desire. But we remain very confident that as we continue to provide resources, we're seeing not just K through 12 education. I mean, all 47 states and 2 territories have already published plans and guidance for reopening their schools. And we reiterated to the governors earlier this week and again at the summit yesterday that we're really here to partner with them to achieve that. And I think what the President was saying this morning is that if there are aspects of the CDC's recommendations that are prescriptive or that serve as a barrier to kids getting back to school, we want governors and local officials and education leaders to know that we're here to work with them to support the measures they're putting into place. But I think that every American knows that we can safely reopen our schools, and we want, as the President said this morning, to make sure that what we're doing doesn't stand in the way of doing that.
Can I just follow up on that, sir?
Go ahead.
Just to follow up, when we're talking about the health of children, though, shouldn't the guidance be tough, and should no expense be spared?
Well, I'm going to ask Bob Redfield to speak to that. One of the things that we have seen, and I tell you, as a parent, as much as your vice president and the head of this task force, I've been grateful for it, is that apart from having an underlying health condition, children do not appear to be susceptible to serious illness from the coronavirus. Dr. Burks can speak to that statistically on a global basis, and that's been a blessing for Americans and American families. And so, as Secretary Azar just said, we know that the risk of serious illness to children is very low. And there are measures we can put into place to make sure that we don't see the spread of the virus or outbreaks in individual schools by having children learn in a single classroom or learn outside as often as possible, not go into larger settings. And this is all the kind of guidance that the CDC is putting forward. But I'm going to let Bob Redfield speak to that, because we really do believe that we can open these schools safely, given what we've seen in terms of outcomes among children, and also the kind of measures that we think we can put into effect to prevent the spread.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. I think it's really important to be clear that our recommendations to open these schools are really based on the sound public health and safety and health of children. I think you heard already from some of the speakers, there's substantial health consequences that we've seen as a consequence of schools being closed, whether it's access to mental health services, or it's access to nutrition. Clearly, we know a lot, and I think it's important that we don't react emotionally, but we act based on data. Clearly, the ability of this virus to cause significant illness in children is very, 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 very limited. We know of the post-immune inflammatory disease that you've heard about, but it's very rare. But in general, this virus does not cause significant illness in children. Secondly, and I think it's important, unlike influenza, where one of our biggest concerns is we've been able to show that it's really schools and children that become the instrument of transmission throughout our community. With influenza, we really don't have evidence that children are driving the transmission cycle of this. The most important thing as we reopen schools, and as I mentioned before, we're prepared to work with every school and every school district to help them find the right mixture of strategies for them to do this safely. Our recommendations are not requirements, and they're not meant to be prescriptive. We have lots of different options on how the schools can put it together. But what we do want to reiterate as we reopen schools is to remember the importance of protecting the vulnerable. That we will be strong on. It's important to limit the ability of individuals with significant comorbidities, individuals that happen to be elderly with comorbidities. We want to limit those individuals, their interactions in general in society, independent of the schools.
Thanks, Bob. And let me say, just also in response to your question, I would recommend that every American review the statement issued by the American Academy of Pediatrics that released an important report indicating that there are real physical and mental cause for children to be deprived of an in-classroom setting. Ranges from nutrition to children that have special needs. We heard from Dr. McCann's Katz that some 7 million children in America deal with mental health issues, and the services and the counseling they receive at their schools. And so we want to put the health and well-being of our kids first. And given the fact that children, as Dr. Redfield said again, do not appear to be susceptible to serious outcomes from the coronavirus, we want to put the totality of their health and their well-being forward. And that all tells us, it tells the President, tells this task force, that means we need to get our kids back to school.
You're talking about the guidance that the CDC has put out. It sounds like you think it is in the best interest of students and ways to safely reopen schools so far. So are you going to change that guidance because the president said that he does not like it?
Well, I think I just want to reiterate, we're going to continue to work with local states and jurisdictions. I think the guidance that we've put out gives a series of different strategies for them to consider what is the most appropriate in their unique situation to adopt again, and I want to come back to the goal. And the goal of this is to get schools reopened. I did mention, and I want to reiterate, that goal is just not a goal to reopen schools. That's a goal because we believe that's in the best public health interest of the students for the reasons you've heard. We will continue to develop and evolve our guidance to meet the needs of the schools and the states that we continue to provide that assistance to.
Thanks, guys. Thanks, guys.
I'm sorry, I can't hear your question. Go ahead.
The guidance recommends that schools have social distancing of students 6 feet apart. And that's why these schools are adopting these hybrid models, is because they don't feel they can keep students 6 feet apart within their building. So I'm just wondering if that particular part of the guidance is something you're rethinking, or do you support that social distancing inside schools? Because that's where schools, I think, are having trouble.
Well, the president said today we just don't want the guidance to be too tough. And that's the reason why next week CDC is going to be issuing a new set of tools, 5 different documents that will be giving even more clarity on the guidance going forward. But we know each school system, has unique capabilities, different facilities, and what parents around the country should know is that we're here to help. We're here to work with their governors, with their local education officials to get our kids back to school. I mean, the truth of the matter is that as we reopen America, we've got to reopen our schools for the well-being of our kids, for their academic advancement, for working families, but also, as you've heard again today, to continue the momentum that we see in this economy that we saw last week with nearly 5 million jobs created. And I want to promise the American people we're going to stay focused at this task force on saving lives, meeting the needs of our state and our healthcare workers, on protecting the vulnerable, and reopening America's economy, schools, work, and worship. So thank you all very much. We'll talk to you in a few days.